Okay, so last week I was talking about Halloween, and I was saying that Michael Myers was scary because of his unexplained, ambiguous nature. But something that always lingered with me, and something I want to talk about in a separate video, was just how he was able to seemingly blend in with the world and literally get away with murder. Now, you take this idea of a peaceful, middle-class, friendly town being intruded by a killer, and apply the in the wrong place at the wrong time logic of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and in theory, you get the Strangers.
Ah yes, this 70s wannabe occasionally pops its head up when talking about the home invasion subgenre. It has a pretty modest cult following despite honestly not being all that good a film from a technical standpoint. But in many respects, it works best when it's simple and rudimentary as opposed to the painfully generic horror movie it turns into. In its context, The Strangers works on the fact that it authentically captures that unnerving feeling of being home alone at night. As far as slasher movies are concerned, The Strangers makes no attempt to indulge in being overtly stylistic. It's not trying to have that typical artificial nightmare setup, it simply wants you to believe in how real it is by being seemingly devoid of an elaborate look and just feeling, well, ordinary. There's no ominous fog or moody lighting or dynamic composition, it's just a big house and two photogenic characters eating ice cream and feeling sorry for themselves for very valid reasons. It's inconsistent though, when it tries to be too boisterous, it loses that feeling of realism. And because it was writer and director Brian Bertino's first film, and starting with a horror movie is like jumping in at the deep end, it ends up devolving into a jump scare fest as opposed to this atmospherically dry but intriguingly palpable idea that, yeah, could have been much better handled. As art cinema goes, if it's real, it must be boring, but as art cinema also goes, that's what makes it strangely compelling. What you're looking at, in theory, is a film that starts out as a naturalistic horror movie. Sound, for example, is mostly diegetic, there is a soundtrack, but it doesn't carry the film, and the heavy reliance on quietness perpetuates the isolation and eerie feeling that something definitely isn't right. At the same time, the tension mostly consists of waiting patiently for horror to literally arrive. It's this weird enigma where it's not so much entertaining as it is a very well-conditioned imitation of reality that creaks, shadows, and mundane objects come off as immensely more intimidating as a result. It's like looking out the window at night into the darkness and implanting the image of a figure just staring right back at you. Once the thought is there, everything starts to feel unstable. In fact, the production designers said that the house was fundamentally key to the horror as it was a cozy, safe place that's full of strong memories. This makes the picture even more frightening because you realize that terror can occur even in your most comfortable environments. That's honestly a perfect summary of what the film is trying to do with its setting. The entire premise is built upon our association of home as our place of safety and security. Once it's compromised, then there is nothing to protect you. And this takes us to the heart of it all. It might surprise you to know that this little innocuous movie is actually quite a common example used in academic horror culture analysis. I mean legitimate academic publications. The Strangers was inspired by numerous real-life occurrences, specifically the Charles Manson family tape murders in 1969 and Bertino's childhood experience of neighborhood break-ins. Bertino explained that one night while his parents were out, random strangers knocked on the door and asked for a person that didn't live there. What Bertino soon discovered was that if nobody answered the door, the strangers would break in. The tape murders, on the other hand, had a bit more obscurity. Many theorized Charles Manson had ordered his followers to murder music producer Terry Melcher for basically snubbing Manson as a musician. Everybody wanted to be a goddamn musician back then. But by then, actress Sharon Tate and filmmaker Roman Polanski were renting the house, so the brutal incident that occurred was a result of simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Coupling this idea with Bertino's own experiences, he chose to tell a story from the victim's point of view without any context to the intruders. In his words, you read obituaries every day where someone is killed for a random reason. Yes, you may eventually find out why, but sometimes they don't. In The Strangers, the scariest point the film makes is that the killers have absolutely no motive. In fact, they simply summarize it with the sinister line,
"'Cause you were home."
Like with the Tate scenario, James and Christian are only the target of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and everything else is utterly meaningless. It's the result of a random and incidental attack, and that's fundamentally what's so haunting about the premise, especially being home alone at night. It's such a non-catalyst event, and there's no indication or connection to make sense of why any of this is happening. And what's worse is not just the idea that anyone can be a victim, but just how easy it is for an event like this to take place. The film isn't so much fear-mongering, but if we were to pull up those academic sources, Phil Simpson described it as increasingly nihilistic in the sense that we have this ordinary setting where sudden, unexpected attacks occur. It's kind of like Funny Games, which yes, is a very thematically different film, but it plays on the idea of just how unfair the character's situation is, and as Simpson points out, it's totally a commentary on the political overtone on public perceptions on random acts of violence. Like I said in my Halloween video, there is a social fear of an outsider intruding on an affluent, peaceful town, and in the 70s, directly after Manson's reign of terror, a lot of horror movies, intentional or not, came in part to reinforce this American middle-class phobia that resurged again after 9/11. The cinematic serial killer has become a symbol for random violence, which invokes greater domestic terror because it's inconceivable and unpredictable when and where it's going to happen. Hence, when you watch the film, the conditions of absolute disinterest and normality work with the persistent, unexpected violent events that the horror feels unjust and harrowing as you are constantly questioning the context of everything. This is a British thing, but when you think about it, it really isn't far off being more of a subversive kitchen sink drama than a horror movie. Don't even think about saying post-horror. Whether intentional or not, sometimes the movie feels more like a Lifetime soap opera. We have these working class killers who find escapism in murder that's almost a disillusioned response to people of a perceptually higher standard of living. In fact, the significance of the masks is entirely theatrical. They treat the invasion as a spectacle performance as they play psychological games with their victims instead of going to the already established endgame. As they drive away, one of them says,
"It'll be easier next time,"
insinuating like it's a dress rehearsal as they try to improve their craft, so to speak, again reinforcing the twisted perspective of how fun and easy it is for these insignificant killers. The fact the film chooses not to linger on their faces goes to show how they ultimately are just faceless everyday people, making it tragically unpleasant how they just fade into the obscurity of everyday life once it's over, echoing a similar social terror exhibited by the Manson family and many other crimes for that matter.
Side note, Glenn Howerton shows up, and now that I've seen It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, it's very difficult to take this scene seriously, which curveballed the entire movie for me.
I might not be a fan of this movie, but the opening does an immense job at establishing a bleak overtone as opposed to direct horror. The film opens with images of the night's events, leaving this brooding air of mystery of what happened here as we open from the perspective of two kids arriving at the crime scene like a theorized docudrama reconstruction. The opening shots are low-frame, slow-motion POVs of a truck driving past random neighborhood houses, immediately showing how these killers are looking for random victims, a bit like how the camera in Psycho chooses that one random window to voyeuristically intrude upon. Any of these families could be victims, and it leaves this lingering idea as to how other families would tackle the same situation, which is intensified by a transition to a more sorrowful atmosphere instead of bluntly horrific. The kid crying in distress, the placement of objects, the blood, the broken windows, it's so organic looking and doesn't feel staged. It's visually described like most murder scenes in true crime stories. And from there, you know this isn't going to end well for either of the couple, conveying a tragic mood that reflects on obituaries and our emotional response to random violence imposed upon unwilling victims who we quickly come to sympathetically connect with in terms of their frustrations and alienation.
The Strangers is such a conflicting experience. On the one hand, it genuinely has a terrifying idea, but on the other, its execution does not match up to its concept. I actually felt that the film was better when I felt sympathetic as opposed to being scared, which is something that works very nicely into next week's video, which, keeping with this inadverted, middle-class horror thing I've got going, we're going to be looking at horror logic using a film that is all about formulas, patterns of predictability, and most of all, how idiots can actually make for some of the scariest killers of all. Apparently. See you next week. Hey folks, thanks for watching, and thank you to everyone that helped me on Patreon. With the whole AdSense apocalypse thing going on, my funds have went down, and because of that I can't really increase the production of the show, so every $1 or $2 on Patreon helps make this a better show all round. So please do consider supporting me if you want. And until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye!